Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us here in the community room where it's a little bit chilly, so hope everybody's comfortable. And welcome also to everybody watching via Zoom. You stayed at home where it's warm and dry, and so here we are. It's a little chilly in this room tonight, but we'll get through it. I have some books over here for those of you who are in the room that are related to, sorry, I didn't get on my mark, Mr. DeMille. Anyway, I have some books over here related to tonight's program. So if you want to browse through those, and some of them look very good, maybe check them out and take them home. I want to tell you about a couple of things we have coming up, and then we'll get started on tonight's program. Excuse me. Next Wednesday, we have William Pack. That's February 15th at 6:30. William has been with us before. He's a very good speaker, variety of topics, but he's going to talk about memory this time. And he's going to talk about the different kinds of memory, why we remember certain things, and that we can't always rely on what we recall. He will also give us some tips on a healthier brain and improving our memory. So that's next Wednesday, and it's hybrid. And our concert for February is on February 19th at 2 p.m. That's a Sunday, of course. And we have a program or a concert called Both Sides Now. Pat Gaughan and Nancy Mayo will be performing music of the 60s and 70s, specifically female singer-songwriters like Joan Baez, Judy Collins, Joni Mitchell, ladies like that. So that should be a really good program, our concert. Oh, and we have a movie on the 21st, Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock, Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris. Okay, so tonight we are, you all, whether you're here or at home, are in store for a really great program. We have with us Clarence Goodman, and he is a self-described historian and entertainer whose travels, both actual and literal, have taken him all over the map. But fortunately, he came back to his hometown in Chicago, and we get to benefit from his experiences. And he is in demand at libraries, cultural centers, history centers, on radio, TV, film. So he shares all of these programs with a variety of groups. So we're very lucky to have him tonight. And he will be sharing one of his more than 30 programs. And the title is, of course, Emancipation to Inauguration, Chicago's Black Experience. Please welcome Clarence Goodman.
Thanks, Janet. Hello, everybody. Keep clapping it up for Janet, please, everybody. And you'll stay warmer that way if you do that. And also clap it up for my buddy Mike over here, too. Mike, can we do something with the lights a little bit? How is everyone tonight? Sir, you're either in love or you're cold, holding your hands like that. I mean, this is so sudden. Ma'am, if you don't have gloves, I have an extra set that I can lend you. This lady laughs on cue, I swear. I feel like I'm in a Mel Brooks movie. Good evening, everybody. Thanks, Mike. Welcome to Emancipation. I almost forgot the name of the program. Emancipation to Inauguration, Chicago's Black Experience, where we're going to do a very, very quickly paced survey, if you will, of the impactful people, click, places, and events of African-American history in Chicago as we explore our shared American narratives. If you have a phone, and that's all three of you, oh, I just revealed to Zoom land that there are three people here. Sorry, Zoom land. Please mute your phones. All of this fake charm evaporates like nothing if your phone goes off. And also, if you have questions and comments and so forth, oh, look at that. Everybody's looking at their phone. How cute. It's choreographed. Please save your comments and questions for later. All of the images I'm using within the fair use parameters of the American copyright law. It starts with this guy, Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. Boy, this poor soul looks a little like me. That's where the similarity ends. This gentleman, who was the son of a gentleman from Quebec and a woman from Haiti wandered into Chicago at about 1790. A full century and a half after the first non-Indigenous people came here. This, of course, was Father Marquette and Louis Joliet, but Jean-Baptiste Pointe-du-Sable is the first non-Indigenous person to settle in Chicago, or Chicago, which would, of course, become Chicago, 1790. Keep that date in mind. So he's not around for very long. He blows out of town pretty quickly. Why? Because maybe the biggest issue of the 19th century in all of the United States, the issue of race specifically when it came to the right to own people or not. And this was tearing the country asunder, and it was a big, big problem all over the territories and all over the United States at the time. However, we did have the advent of the Underground Railroad, these angels who squired and shepherded people from their enslaved states all the way to the promised land, the North. And no city was more north, not from a geographical perspective, but from a cultural perspective, than Chicago. By the time that Chicago is incorporated as a town, 43 years after Jean-Baptiste Pointe-du-Sable arrives in 1833, 400 people are here. Wow, we could fit them in the library, couldn't we? But this is at a crucial time when this whole issue of slavery is going to tear the country apart. Now, Chicago, though it is in a free area and a free state, there is a wink-wink policy of, hey, if we know that this person is an escaped slave, we will extradite them or repatriate them. So it's the myth that the northern states were this Shangri-La. So a lot of people came to Chicago, whew, I'm tired, but I'm not too tired, so tired I'm going to stay here. I'm going to Canada. So it was the last stop before Canada, many of them. So I want you to meet one of our angels. Meet Mr. John Jones. Hello, Mr. Jones, how you doing? This guy was a well-to-do tailor in downtown Chicago. By day, hello, I think pinstripes would make you look much slimmer, sir, but you are the boss. By night, creeping around, helping people with the Underground Railroad when it came to squiring in these people, letting them crash in the basement, and then getting them acclimated to become citizens of Chicago, or letting them rest up before they took that last leg up to Canada. One of our first angels. And then here's one of our first key places here. The advent of Quinn Chapel. African Methodist Episcopalian Church was established in Chicago in 1847, the first African-American church in the Chicago experience. The first one burnt down. There was this tricky fire that happened a few decades later. Maybe you heard of it, but it was soon after rebuilt, soon after the fire, and this was the rebuilt version. This version of this church is still there at the corner of 24th and Wabash, as beautiful as it was back in the day, more than a century, close to a century and a half ago. Quinn Chapel. Also, at around this time, Cook County Hospital opens in 1857. Wow. What's the big deal? Well, one, it's still there. Very, very important. Even though it's no longer Cook County Hospital, but rather a property of the Hyatt Corporation, and it has a food court and things of this nature, the building is still there. Most of you remember it from the wonderful Harrison Ford picture, The Fugitive. Look here, I'm going to get you. Yes, that is where they shot some of the many scenes in that picture. This is important, though, although you did get to see me do Harrison Ford, because this was the definitive free hospital in Cook County. And as such, the plurality, if not the majority, of African Americans born in Chicago and Cook County were born here between when it opened and when it closed. So when you think of famous African Americans from Chicago born here, it's a good chance they were born in that building. So when you're there on Harrison and you walk by, you're looking at the birthplace of almost everybody. That's pretty cool. Now, speaking of birthplace, this issue of slavery led to the formation of a political party in our neighbor to the north, Wisconsin. That would be the Republican Party of the 1850s. And this party, let's be very clear, was predicated on the abolitionment of slavery. And so, since the biggest town nearby, the birthplace of the Republican Party, was Chicago. Whenever I ask for an answer, the answer is Chicago or Al Capone or Oprah Winfrey or one of my parents, depending on what the question is. Chicago was a big deal with regard to the early Republican Party. That's one of the reasons the Chicago Tribune was a Republican paper for such a long time. You're looking at the Tremont House or the Hotel Tremont, which was located in the Loop at the junction of Lake Street and Dearborn, so right in the theater district. This was owned by the family of one Ira Couch, and they were big time GOPers, big time. So anytime some really, really important rising political candidates of the GOP party would come to town, this is where they would invariably stay, including this guy. Before he grew his playoff beard, Abraham Lincoln began his relationship with Chicago in 1847. And indeed, he grew his beard after his election. So he was bald-faced for the longest time, but he came to Chicago all of the time. And indeed, when the GOP convened in Chicago in 1860, they nominated him. He wasn't there, though, because back in those days, it was seen as undignified for a political candidate to go to a political convention or campaign. They had surrogates all over the place, proxies all over the place. Nevertheless, this man is nominated and then subsequently elected in November. And he realizes, I do. The second he says, I do, Fort Sumter is fired upon. And so the 16th president of the United States understands that the preservation of the Union is going to be the first and maybe only time that the United States will be involved in a total war. And he recognizes that as the commander-in-chief in a total war, he is cloaked with incredible power, unprecedented use of some power, including the resource of African Americans who wanted to fight, the resource of African Americans to fight for this land that we love. And so with this in mind, the 29th Infantry Division is born in Chicago, USA, the first all-Black regiment in American history. Wow! Speaking of wow, meet Mr. Joseph Hudlin. Joseph Hudlin worked for the Chicago Board of Trade, and he and his good wife, Anna Elizabeth Hudlin, they lived in this growing little section just south of the Loop that was known as the Black Belt that would eventually grow into Bronzeville. And one of the things they did, living so close to downtown, they were shepherds, they were conductors for the Underground Railroad. And so they would help people out at their home and then get them to Canada or get them dispersed through the neighborhood. Now, the Civil War comes and it goes, and America is changed mightily. The city that's changed the most during the Civil War is Chicago. The Industrial Revolution combined with the Civil War, combined with Chicago's location in the continent, combined with the I.M. Canal, turned Chicago into some kind of something. So by the time the Civil War ends, the population of Chicago is 1/3 people. And we weren't prepared for all of this, were we? And thus we have the fire. The biggest fire in the biggest boom town known to human history. Now, thinking back on our friends, the Hudlins, Mr. Hudlin, he worked in the Loop at the Board of Trade. Not only did he and his wife hang around as the fire bore down on downtown Chicago, he and his wife helped people safely out of the Loop into the north side and came back to help more. But moreover, Mr. Hudlin, working for the Board of Trade, realizes that Chicago is the capital of America's agricultural concerns and everything. So he goes to the Board of Trade building, gets all of the records that he can pick up, takes them down to the sub basement. I just wanted you guys to see how low I could go. And he hides them. And they're safe. And this man to this day is a Chicago and Board of Trade hero, transcendent of being an African-American hero. Oh, my goodness gracious. As Chicago rebuilt after the fire, goodness gracious, by 1890, there are more than 1 million people who live here. And then this lady comes to town. Yeah, baby. Ida B. frickin' Wells comes to town. She swaggers into Chicago after having just kicked all kinds of backside and taken names in Memphis, where the KKK tried to run her out of town when she tried to throw a light on the horrors of Jim Crow. She says, oh no, I'm not afraid. Memphis is just too small of a city for me. I'm going to Chi-Town, because she knew that Chicago was growing at such a rate she could talk to and reach more people from Chicago. And so she rolls into town in 1892. She meets this gentleman, a newspaper man by the name of Ferdinand Barnett. First comes love, then comes marriage, and then comes Miss Wells with a baby carriage. Not only do they fall in love and get together, but they form arguably one of the first power couples in the history of Chicago. And a writer and a newspaper man hooking up. Oh, that is a match made in heaven. You're still laughing out there. I see you. Meet Lucy Parsons. Lucy Parsons and her progressive activist husband, a former white, no, I should say a white former Confederate soldier. They meet, and you can clearly see she was not white. They met in Texas, fell in love, and they were both these progressive liberals. And Albert Parsons only was fighting for Texas and the Confederacy because that's where he was born. So they are these aspiring progressives ready to kick the international conglomerates and all of that, and Teapot Dome and all of these things right in the backside. Where do they think they should go? Chicago, right? Come on, get a little quicker there. They go to Chicago because Chicago was growing and growing and growing and growing fast. Well over 1 million people by the 1800s and 90s. Miss Parsons' husband, Albert Parsons, was so two-fisted with regard to labor and union that he was implicated, charged, tried, convicted, condemned, and hanged for the Haymarket riot. So did she scat on home to mom with her 2 children? She picked up her dead husband's baton. She had her baton, and for the rest of her life, she fought the good fight. No less of a two-fisted liberal than Studs Terkel said that when he was a little boy, he would go listen to her at Bughouse Square in the River North area of Chicago. You inspire Studs Terkel, you've lived a really, really, really productive and good life. Provident Hospital opens up in 1891. This is how it looked in 1891. That building is still there, but it's no longer Provident Hospital, because the current day Provident Hospital is this enormous Dr. Frankenstein behemoth of buildings surrounding it. It's a tiny little apartment building. Why is this important? Because you're looking at the first integrated hospital in the American experience. But wait, there's more. On staff there, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, an African-American surgeon who performed the first successful open heart surgery in American history. Wow. Meet Gus. Meet my man, Gus Tolton. Gus Tolton came up from Texas. He had been a slave. He wanders up to Chicago like everybody was starting to trickle up north to Chicago, and he converts to Roman Catholicism. And then he starts to do good works in the name of the church, and then he decides to take instruction, and he is ordained. He becomes the first African-American ordained to the priesthood in world history. This kid from Bronzeville who was known as Father Gus. Wait a minute. He's been canonized. Ladies, sir, I give you Saint Augustus Tolton. Not bad for a kid from the South Side, huh? Oh, and then it happens. Chicago becomes a world-class city. Oh my goodness gracious. Anybody who lived here already knew it was. But the world was put on notice in 1893 when the World's Fair, the World's Columbian Exposition, came to Chicago. Wow. 1893. The population of Chicago in 1833 was 400. When the World's Fair opens, the population is 1,125,000. And then subsequently, 27 million people came through Chicago for this World's Fair. So we were swaggering around. Yeah, that's right. Oops. The powers that be prohibited African Americans from exhibiting at all, even though nations from all over the world and every state in the Union had an exhibition space. Well, clearly these people had never met Ida B. Wells. So Ida B. Wells drops the depth charge of boycott. I know, don't start a boycott. We'll compromise. And she says, all right. The compromise was one day. Colored People's Day, Negro Day, whatever obnoxious names you can think of, they called it. However, we ran with this one-day compromise, in spite of the fact that all of the newspapers and so forth lampooned the idea of Black people showing and Black people putting on exhibits and the like. Here's a little piece showing and illustrating that the only way you were going to get Black people there was to give out free watermelon. I'm surprised there's not a fried chicken image there as well. And then something interesting happens. As what usually happens, people from outside of the United States treat African Americans better than our compatriots do. And so around the word falls on Haiti, and Haiti says, we have our own pavilion. We are going to share the Haitian pavilion with the brothers and sisters in the United States for this one day. So what happens at the Haitian pavilion? The Congress on Africa, an unprecedented event where countries from all over Africa come together and talk shop. And they invited representatives from Black America to do so. So if our own country doesn't care about us or think we're anything, at least the rest of the world is starting to. All of this at the Haitian Pavilion. The Haitian Pavilion, the Columbia Basin behind the Museum of Science and Industry, the Haitian Pavilion was to the east of that, just to the east of that, between that basin and Lakeshore Drive. That's where the Haitian Pavilion was. Oh, when you got a man like this talking, everybody's listening. In addition to starting the hairstyle that would be popular in the 1960s and beyond, Frederick Douglass came to town and he threw down. And he was the embodiment of the Black experience at the time. And at this point on, for the rest of his life, he would be the definitive leader of the African-American movement. But in addition to this, nice people making speeches and stuff, all kinds of representatives from all the traditional African-American colleges and universities came in one form or another. Meet the Hampton University Choir. They come, tra-la, they throw down, they do well. And then like everybody else Black who came to Chicago for the World's Fair, they checked out Bronzeville. Wow, man, this is something else. It's a self-sustained community. Jiminy Crickets, if we ever needed to move to the north, we could find a home in Chicago. Foreshadowing implied. One of these individuals, though, was a young man. Where is he? No, there. Robert Abbott comes to Chicago with the choir. He says, this is cool, but Bronzeville is even cooler. I'm coming back as soon as I save enough money. Foreshadowing implied. Oh, another Black presence at the World's Fair. The World's Fair gives us Aunt Jemima pancakes and the self-contained mix, and more importantly, it gives us the image of and the actual Aunt Jemima. The image, as we saw for many, many decades, over a century, and the actual woman named Nancy Green. Now, I'm citing this for you and showing this to you because we're going to look very closely, actually not very closely, somewhat obliquely, at the evolution of the imagery and the use of our faces, the face of Black people, when it comes to advertising and when it comes to product manufacturing and so forth. So everybody snap a picture with your mind's eye, click, and we'll come back to it. At the same time, all kinds of musicians are rolling into Chicago because, wow, where there are 27 million people, I should be able to get a gig. One of these cats was a fellow by the name of Scott Joplin, who was putting a new approach to a brand new genre called jazz. He was already crafting a subgenre that would use the light staccato touch on the piano and all of the subsequent instruments and voices. This would be called ragtime. So ragtime gets its first full breath, courtesy of Mr. Joplin, obviously, in the city of Chicago. Meet Jesse Binga. Jesse Binga was a barber and a Pullman porter, and he swaggers into Chicago looking for some action during the World's Fair with 10 bucks in his pocket. Fortunately, he didn't go to the levee district and blow that $10, but rather he used his real big brain. And within 20 years, this $10 bankroll he had amassed into a real estate and banking empire that was the envy of bankers and realtors all over the United States, not just Chicago, not just Illinois. Jesse Pinkett, his house in Washington Park is a local landmark. The Pekin Theater opens up in 1905. This is important because this is the first fully owned and operated African-American theater in American history. And it was, I believe, on State Street and about 27th. I believe there's a parking lot there now. What a shock. A parking lot in Chicago that has no cars in it. Fannie Emanuel comes to town. Fannie Emanuel comes to town during this wave of these wonderful angels who will really, they won't invent social work and settlement houses, but just like Marshall Field and Sears did with retail stores, all these women coming to Chicago, these angels absolutely perfect the advent of social work and settlement houses. However, the Hull House, the most famous of them all, segregated. Really? Yes, Clarence, really. So Fannie Emanuel comes to town. She says, oh, no, we can't have this. So Fannie Emanuel sets up the first integrated settlement house in American history, obviously named the Emanuel House. Jack Johnson takes on the entire white world and hits it all right in the mouth and becomes the first Black heavyweight champion of the world in 1910. So this country boy from Texas has now got celebrity and pockets filled with money. Where should he go? Very good, Chicago. So he moves to Chicago, personally integrates the Everlay Club. You will laugh at that later at some point, my friends. But he also opens up his own club in Bronzeville, and he is a local celebrity, and he is the first of the triumvirate of African-American heavyweight champs who moved to Chicago because Chicago was where it was at. Mr. Jack Johnson. Now, while all of this is going on, the Black experience all over the United States, but especially in big towns like Chicago, is really in so many ways mirroring the existence of white America. But we never hear about that. We never talk about that because we have a tendency to think of people who are dissimilar from us as monolithic. So all Black people are this way, all white people are this way, this, that, and the other thing. Well, look at this. On the south side of Chicago, the Elks Club, Black lodges. I thought there were only two lodges in the whole world, the raccoons and the water buffaloes for the longest time. But there, yes, you can, Janet, go ahead and laugh. And give me the friendly raccoon hello. Woohoo! Yes, honeymooners reference for those of you out there born before 1960. Elks, Black fraternities, Black sororities, and all of these things. Look at this, Bronzeville. We welcome Teenan Jones. My goodness, Mr. Teenan Jones, everybody. Yay! Mr. Teenan Jones, this guy is styling and profiling. Look at this Homburg hat. Look at this mustache. It's trimmed. It looks so good. It looks fake. It's not. This man is a very, very accomplished businessman on the south side of Chicago by day. Restaurants, clubs, all kinds of things. By night, he was the architect of the South Side policy on this in Chicago. What does that mean? He created the numbers, playing the numbers. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Yes, I knew you would. Yes, illegal gambling. When you grow up on the south side of Chicago, if you were of a certain age, you hear about people playing the numbers. And I had no idea what it was. It's like, oh, it's illegal gambling. It's a lottery. Cash only, millions involved. And this man's product was so successful that the Capone organization came and said, you take care of this. We got your back. You got our front. We're not going to mess with you at all. Al Capone respected what was going on so much that he didn't muscle in on it at all. However, the successors of Mr. Jones, one of them, I believe his son or younger brother, got murdered in prison, murdered after he got out of prison by one Sam Giancana, who was trying to impress the Chicago mob bosses in the 1950s because he wanted to become the head of the Chicago mob. It worked. Moreover, and more importantly, and more transcendently, every state lottery in America, in one way, shape, form, or another, is based on policy on the South Side. South Side, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Robert Abbott, he's back. He's back, baby. He comes to Chicago like he promised. He gets a flat in Bronzeville, and he gets the idea for a newspaper, a newsletter, a weekly newsletter that he will publish from his landlady's kitchen table. And this, of course, begins as the Chicago Defender. And it grows and it grows and it grows, and then it becomes the Daily Defender. And you can make an argument up until the point where it became internet only, I believe right before President Obama was elected or shortly before. It was the most important and definitive African-American newspaper in Chicago. But wait, there is more. How did Robert Abbott do this? He worked his tail off, and he was really, really smart. He understands that there's another company, largely Black driven on the south side of Chicago, the Pullman sleeper cars, who employed 10,000 Black men, all named George, all based in Chicago and other parts. And so Mr. Abbott goes to them and says, fellas, I have a newspaper. You have the means and method to get around all the time. Take a stack of my papers, sell what you can, bring me back 60%, keep 40 for yourselves. And so by doing this, Mr. Abbott guarantees that his newspaper will be the first Black paper in America, national distribution. That's pretty cool. But one more thing about the Porters. Not only was the advent of the Pullman Porters the inspiration of and really the means to ascent of the first Black-driven labor union in American history, the Brotherhood of the Pullman's Porters, which was headed by Mr. Philip Randolph. But this was maybe the first job in American history where a Black or a brown person didn't need a college degree to get it, secure it, and make enough money and work steadily enough to propel them into the next zone as far as the economy was concerned. 10,000 Black men, all named George. And at this point, we have this trickle to the north. People are starting to hear about Chicago, hear about Detroit, hear about St. Louis, and they're seeing firsthand the cruddy things that are going on in the South, but they hear that Chicago is this Shangri-La. Click. But then this trickle to the north turns into a swell and then eventually a tsunami, largely driven by our old pal Jim Crow and all of his relatives raining down white terror on Black and brown people in the South and, frankly, in rural towns in the North, too. Because I had enough friends in college who were from small towns in Indiana and Illinois and Wisconsin. They told me some horrible things that they used to see. Bob Dylan wrote a song about a lynching on one of his records, Highway 61 Revisited. Yeah, they sold postcards at the hanging. He saw postcards of a lynching in his small town of Hibbing, Minnesota. So Jim Crow fueling the trickle to the run to the sprint. And then also picking up where William Tecumseh Sherman left off, the boll weevil comes to town. It comes to the whole old South and says, hey, we're going to destroy the rest of your agrarian society. And so what do the white property owners do? They try to rain down more terror on Black people to intimidate us and control us. And so the Great Northern Drive in earnest becomes the Great Migration. And it really starts to kick into gear during World War I. A confluence of things come together, and Chicago is smack dab in the middle of it. But more about that another time. So look at all of these veins. People are heading out west. Hey, going west, going to the northeast. Ooh, traffic. Oh, going to Chicago. A million trillion songs, slight exaggeration, written by blues and jazz musicians for the next 50 years about going to Chicago. One of my favorite great old blues songs is Chicago Bound Blues by Bessie Smith. And she names the Chicago Defender. Well, the guy who wrote it, Sox Wilson, it names the Chicago Defender in the song. Now, if you are dropping the name of the Chicago Defender, you're very authentic, aren't you? So the Great Migration affects everybody, but it doesn't affect anybody like it affects Chicago. But in 1910, before World War I, we made up roughly 2% of Chicago's population. Oh, good for us. La-di-da. 1 year before I made my rather dubious arrival in this world, 1960, we accounted for 25% of the town. Oh, and by the way, Chicago's population in 1 century from 1833 to 1933 has grown from 400 to 3.5 million people. And this is the beginning of the Chicago Renaissance, and specifically the Chicago Black Renaissance. So we moved up north to the south side. But then, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. When Johnny comes marching home again from World War I, he doesn't like all of us uppy Negroes doing all this stuff, because how are you going to keep them down on the farm once they've seen Paris? So the Red Summer, the summer of 1919, an unprecedented epidemic of terrorism against Black people in this country. All over, not just the South, but you got race riots and lynchings and so forth all over. And the biggest one, of course, was where? Chicago, US of A, the race riot of 1919, which they conveniently never teach you in school when you're growing up in Chicago or in Chicagoland. But let's be very clear, it was not isolated in 1919. From July 1st, 1917 to March of 1921, a Black occupied or owned business or residence was bombed every 23 days. That's a lot of violence, and it's a lot of dead people, and it's a lot of destruction of property. So the word that's going around the country and around the world basically says, well, this couldn't be helped, and Black people can't take care of their own stuff, and blah, 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 blah. Well, this is because the national wire services are all owned by whites. And a solution to this problem is arrived at by Mr. Claude Barnett, another newspaper man, who says, well, you know what? We got to have fairness in journalism. So he establishes the first Black-centric wire service, the Negro Associated Press, just to get the word out from the street and from the victims as far as what is going on in Chicago. Sears Roebuck, each and every one of you had a Saturday afternoon or 3 wasted by your parents in a Sears store, weren't you? Didn't you, when you were kids? Yeah, you're getting mad now. You love your parents, but no, don't take me to Sears. Well, Sears Roebuck, traditionally one of the most philanthropic and progressive companies ever. While they were writing checks and doing all kinds of things, they had another key hand in aiding us, the marginalized and the disenfranchised. It was called the Sears Catalog. Imagine that you are a person of color, and you know when you go to the store, especially downtown, store detective, the clerks, everybody's going to watch you. And you're going to be accused of something eventually. It happened to me all the time. My mother would always say, don't put your hands in your pocket. These people will think you're stealing something. So, and I'm from Chicago. Imagine living in Richmond or Atlanta or Memphis or any other city in the deep South or a rural town. Well, you say, you know what? I can go to my old Sears catalog and order anything from a toothbrush to a prefabricated house and have it delivered. And I won't have anybody breathing down my neck, harassing me and accusing me of something. And so in their way, Sears Roebuck accidentally helps this drive for equality and freedom. Thank goodness for that. So another opening, the Regal Theater opens at 47th and what is now Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. The Regal Theater was Chicago's answer to the Apollo Club. So if you were a big time act between their opening and their closing, I believe in about 1975, 80, something like that, that's where you played. And the list of legendary people who performed there one way or another spans all genres of music, spans everything. Not far from there, we have the Wabash Avenue YMCA. publishing the quarterly Journal of Negro History, where it's going to be a journal of Negro history, and it's going to be published every 3 months, Department of Redundancy Department. But something stems from that. One of the directors, Journal of Negro History, was this gentleman, Carter Woodson. Now, back in these days, let's be very clear, 95% of Black people in America were Republicans. And the Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln. As my grandmother used to say, we owe it to Abraham Lincoln. Some of my aunts and uncles told me that she said when they became of age to vote. Carter Woodson, good Republican as he was and a Black man as he was, he says, you know what? It was a big deal to celebrate President Lincoln's birthday. He says, you know what? Let's take a week every year right around President Lincoln's birthday and celebrate Negro history. And this is the beginning of Black History Month. And Janet, that's why it's in February, not because it's a short month, but because Abraham Lincoln did not have the good sense to be born right around Juneteenth. It would be, this place would be packed. If Lincoln had been born in a warmer month, oh my goodness gracious, we'd all have our overcoats off right now, and you ladies wouldn't all be hunched up cold like that. But this is where Black History Month is born on the South Side of Chicago, 1928, as was this former synagogue at 33rd in Indiana, designed by the great Dankmar Adler and Louis Sullivan, becomes a Baptist church in the 1920s. And at the parish, head of the parish, gentleman by the name of the Reverend Thomas A. Dorsey, who's a preacher, he's a composer, he's a pianist, he is a Renaissance man if ever there was one, and he is surrounded by all kinds of songbirds coming up north during the Great Migration who want to sing, including a lady like this, Mahalia Jackson. And so it's at this point that Thomas A. Dorsey begins a crafting of a new genre that combines sacred music and it combines some choral music, swings a little bit, little blues, little nice some chord changes that would remind you of a jazz composition. And of course, he has given birth to gospel music. And the building that I just showed you, it is completely gutted now because it's being converted to the National Museum of Gospel Music. When it's going to open, I don't know. This is Chicago. It could be open tomorrow. I know a guy. That's about all we got going there. Oh, but let's not forget another lady who's on the South Side of Chicago at the time, another songbird. This is Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Sister Rosetta Tharpe, not nearly as well known as Mahalia Jackson, but she was the definitive rival of Mahalia Jackson. Moreover, this woman not only played a guitar, she was arguably the most important guitar player born in the United States in the 20th century. I kid you not. Moreover, she wrote songs, and moreover, she set the precedent of the great, great singer who was torn between the spiritual and the secular, like Sam Cooke was, like Hank Williams was, like Little Richard was, like all of these people were and are, and she, most importantly, a charter member of the Dimples Hall of Fame. Look at those dimples, y'all. And you know she's happy right there because people who have dimples, I hear, they can't help when they flash. For those of you out there with dimples and you know who you are, you're lucky. Who's this guy? I don't know. Third base. This is a beautiful man on the South Side of Chicago playing a beautiful K guitar made in Chicago because Chicago was the biggest manufacturer of inexpensive but good musical instruments for about 50 years in the 20th century. Now, at the same time that gospel is going on, we have a new genre also kicking around on the South Side. It is music specifically for rent parties. A rent party is, if I don't have enough money for my rent, I take what I do have, I throw a party, I hire a band, I buy a lot of liquor, and you laugh. Though I've never had a drink in my life, ma'am, I would buy a lot of liquor, I would charge people admission, and there's where I make my money. And so to keep these people dancing and thirsty, gotta have some music. This music that was crafted for rent parties in Chicago was called skiffle. Skiffle music moves from Chicago east through New York, goes over the Atlantic Ocean, and lands on the ears of a whole bunch of kids in Britain, the anglicized version of it. And before there was Elvis Presley, there was skiffle music inspiring Messrs. Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and everybody in the first generation of British rock stars. I kid you not. But wait, there's more. So all of these great Delta blues musicians are coming up to Chicago. Beautiful. Hey, man, there's a marketplace over there called Maxwell Street. They're hiring. Cool. Got my axe. I sit down and I start to play outside all day acoustically. And by the end of the day, I sound like George Burns. Say goodnight, Gracie. Not to worry. I go to downtown Chicago, which is close. I buy a cheap electric guitar, a cheap microphone, a cheap amplifier. I go back and I plug them in and I start to scream those same blues over those same changes. The marriage of electricity to Delta blues, Chicago blues. Oh my goodness gracious. Poetry in motion, this woman wanted to be a star. Bessie Coleman tried everything to be a star because she felt that she deserved to be a star. I mean, look at her. But it was when the African-American soldiers started to come back from World War I, where they had indeed seen Paris and all of these other European cities. They just captivated her with stories. Oh, Bessie, you could be a star. And she saw the quickest and newest way to stardom being a pilot. And so Bessie Coleman does what she could to become a pilot, and she is a sensation. And she inspires a generation or two or three or four of women to fly and of people of color to fly. And it's so poignant that this kid, this Chicago kid, and another Chicago kid named Amelia Earhart, not only both inspired countless women to fly, but that they both died in airplane crashes is amazing and poignant. And so people like Cornelius Coffey, he wants to be a pilot too. Hey, there's a flight school in the Loop or south of the Loop on Michigan Avenue in Roosevelt. He goes down there, wants to sign up. The guy running the joint says, boy, we don't take your kind here. Here's a broom. So rather than break the broomstick over the guy's head, which would have been, where's the camera? That would have been very tempting. He says, sure, sir, I'll take the job. Sir, when do I start, sir? Why? Because this gives him access to information. And so he crafts his own curriculum, goes out into the suburbs, and pays people to teach him how to fly. He learns how to fly and starts teaching other African Americans, and legendarily, the Tuskegee Airmen, some of them are amongst this group. A college rivalry is born in the early 1930s from the Ohio State University, Mr. Jesse Owens, and from the University of Marquette, Mr. Ralph Metcalf. Now, right here, they are college rivals, and it looks like Mr. Metcalf is beating Mr. Owens. Within a couple of years, though, they will be teammates on the American Olympic team in 1936, where Jesse Owens winning 4 gold medals will become a legend. Ralph Metcalf is only going to win 1 gold medal. But they both get to meet Hitler. Ooh, ah. But Ralph Metcalf comes back to Chicago and he parlays this success and fame into a political career. And Ralph Metcalf becomes arguably the first important African-American politician in Chicago history. So much so, there is a huge building in the federal portion, the federal district of downtown Chicago, named in his honor. Did you know that jazz music, like everything in America, was segregated? The music we invented, we couldn't play with whites. Well, meet Benny Goodman from Chicago. Meet Gene Krupa from Chicago. Meet Teddy Wilson, meet Lionel Hampton, and collectively they were Benny Goodman's first quartet. Great. Benny Goodman, being a Jewish kid from the west side of Chicago, he didn't want anything to do with all this segregation garbage. So he says to Teddy, you know what? My band, my Benny Goodman band, we have a regular gig every Sunday at the Congress Plaza Hotel. I want you to come on down this particular Sunday, which was Easter Sunday, slip on in, slide in, start playing, and let's just cross our fingers that the city of Chicago does not burn down again. He did, and it didn't. And so jazz music was integrated with a whimper rather than a bang. 11 years before anybody ever heard of Jackie Robinson outside of his own family and baseball scouts. Yeah, Easter Sunday, 1936. And around this time, meet Mr. Lloyd Albert Quarterman, who, along with a whole bunch of other really smart people, came to Chicago, specifically to the University of Chicago, where the university had given up its football stadium for a brand new science project, pouring baking soda into vinegar and watching it bubble up. No, I'm kidding. It was the Manhattan Project. An African-American was one of the contributing physicists / engineers to the Manhattan Project. So for what it's worth, the atom was split on the south side of Chicago with the help of people of color and women. We got to recognize John H. Johnson, after the war, he wants to be the epitome of African-American publisher. And he publishes a very popular magazine called the Negro Digest. And it's so popular that Mr. Johnson is able to split these two magazines, or this one magazine, into two, Ebony and Jet magazine. And they prove to be so popular that Mr. Johnson becomes the first African-American on the Forbes list. And this building, designed by the Black architect John Matusami, is the first high-rise office building in American history designed by a Black architect. And it is a monument still today, even though Ebony and Jet long moved out of it because everything's internet now. Nevertheless, there they are, standing, lording over Grant Park as if Mr. Johnson is still there, making sure that the trains run on time. And you thought that was Mussolini who said that. It was John, it was a Chicago dude said that. Meet Mr. Frank Brown. You don't know him by this name, do you? You know him as Uncle Ben. When the converted rice company decided, we want a lovely, docile, friendly-looking black face to put on our converted rice, they picked Mr. Brown, who was a very, very popular, charming-looking, handsome concierge in downtown Chicago. And so, even though it is still, I'm just going to say, objectifying the African-American image, it's a long way from our first Aunt Jemima and images that were contemporary to the earliest ones in the post-Civil War era, let's say. And this is just 60 years after the World's Fair. Oh, man, we can't get through a conversation without this boy and his murder. This 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till goes to Mississippi, is falsely accused of being sexually harassed or whatever, made a pass at by a woman who recently admitted she made up the whole thing just to whatever kind of BS she and her husband had going on, break up to make up and all that. He was subsequently, lynching is too clean of a word to use. The things that happened to this boy erupted when his body came home in a pine box. And it is without question, in my mind anyway, the spark that begins the modern civil rights movement. Now, the wind that blows that spark into a flame, of course, happens in Montgomery just a few short months later. And the parish preacher who reluctantly was pushed to the front of the Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King. And in Martin Luther King's brief but profound career in life, he came to Chicago a whole lot, starting in 1956. And he made his last official trip here in 1967. Why did he come to Chicago? He came to Chicago to desegregate the North. Because how are you going to desegregate the South and not desegregate the North at the same time? And as he used to say, so goes Chicago, so goes the world. That's why he came here. And of course, the civil rights movement in Chicago, the minister, Malcolm X, though his particular mosque was in New York, since the Nation of Islam was headquartered in Chicago, he spent a lot of time here. And even after he was excommunicated from his church, he still came back to Chicago. And indeed, when he was paranoid, for good reason, that somebody was going to kill him, he decided to do a speaking tour to anybody who would listen, as far as talking about his vision and so forth. So this is him talking to Irv Kupcinet a couple of weeks before he was murdered. He was also on the down low in Chicago to testify. He was being deposed by the U.S. attorney who was looking into proceedings to strip the Nation of Islam of its tax-exempt status. Now, if anybody in the nation knew this, it would obviously get to the higher ups and who knew what they were capable of. So these two men die in their work, and this leaves a vacuum that is temporarily filled by this charismatic 20-year-old kid named Fred Hampton. This man, had he lived, could have truly been a visionary. However, murdered in his sleep by the Chicago police. And this typified the era as well as the Democratic Convention in 1968. All of this political chaos showed, one, that the world that Chicago was a mess, and more importantly, Old Man Daley was losing control of his city. And then his death in the 1970s, after all of this political turmoil, creates the climate in which we get our first African-American mayor and our first woman mayor elected. And it took a long time, and we got him again, rolled into one individual who is also an openly gay woman. Can you imagine 50 years ago if an openly gay woman had run for mayoralty of Chicago? Probably wouldn't happen. Obviously, this is the Honorable Lori Lightfoot bringing it on home. And then as we get to the home stretch here, a quick constellation of modern stars. Before there was Spike Lee, there was Oscar Micheaux. More than 100 years ago, a Black filmmaker based in Chicago. The first NFL quarterback who was Black. The first coach in the NFL who was Black. This guy, Fritz Pollard, born in Chicago. Oh, number two, our second heavyweight champ, the Brown Bomber himself, comes bobbing and weaving and moves from Harlem, take that, New York, to the South Side, to Bronzeville, because Bronzeville and Chicago, where it was at. The incomparable Nat King Cole. From a literary perspective, we're in the library, right? We got Richard Wright. We got Click, Lorraine Hansberry. We have Gwendolyn Brooks. My goodness gracious, that's a great place to start when it comes to Chicago Black contributions to American literature. Ooh, and I'm ashamed to admit this, I never heard of this woman until the 44th president of the United States mentioned her in a speech. Diane Nash, a Chicago kid who not only walked shoulder to shoulder with the Freedom Riders, with the people who sat in and all of this, she was actually a leader. And maybe she doesn't get her props today because, one, she's still alive, but more importantly, she's a woman. If you ever see that she is speaking someplace, go see her. I believe she's 85 years old, and she hardly comes out to make public pronouncements because most of her contemporaries, the vast majority of her contemporaries, are all dead. And I've been doing a lot of research on her. She was something else. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad changes the South Side of Chicago by moving the Nation of Islam from Detroit to Chi-Town. More literature. Willard Motley writes what many people thought was the definitive book of the American experience in the middle part of the last century. Knock on Any Door. But wait a minute. In the same family, his nephew, Archibald Motley, a very, very important and really trailblazing portrait painter. Beware of the Ides of March. The Ides of March, 1963, an all-Black squad from Loyola, the Ramblers. They win the NCAA title with no help from Sister Jean. Let the record show. So if she's been there, they would have lost. But the fact that we're not smart enough to play sports without a white person to guide us in all of this was the beginning of putting that to rest. Beginning. Dinah Washington, this kid from Chicago, before she took her own life, she was on her way to being the fourth of the Mount Rushmore of, excuse me, great female jazz singers. Her, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan. That would have been one heck. Sorry, Janet. Heck of a Mount Rushmore. Wendell Campbell, another prominent African-American architect. Wendell Campbell was his name, and he not only studied under Mies van der Rohe, like John Motusami, but like the first generation of people who studied under Mies, they basically copied the Miesian style. So that is why you see so many Miesian buildings in downtown Chicago. Milton Olive III just wanted to be a good soldier, just wanted to fight for the land that he loves. So he did. Went to Vietnam, threw his body on a hand grenade that had been rolled into his camp, sacrificed his life for all of his army buddies. And as a result, he was the first African-American to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. Sam Cooke, baby. Her name is Dr. May Carroll Jemison. In addition to either being dressed up for Halloween or being an astronaut, she's also a doctor, as her title implies, but also an actor, a singer, a dancer, a model, all kinds of things. This Renaissance woman from the University of Chi-Town, Barbara Gardner Proctor, the first woman to head an A&R department in a major record company, and the first person of color to head an A&R department in that same record company, and that record company was Chicago's BJ Records. BJ was located at 14-something South Michigan Ave. On your way to Chess, you'd go by VJ Records. Now, she eventually became the first woman in the history of the United States to own her own advertising agency, excuse me. A man who needs no introduction, the last of our triumvirate of heavyweight champions who moved to Chicago because Chicago was where it was at. LeQ, until last week, the most recognized and decorated and accomplished person ever associated with the Grammy Award. So he and the director of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra were tied, and in comes Beyonce. Single ladies, sorry. But LeQ, the kid from Bronzeville, was doing it before anybody heard of Beyonce. Don Cornelius has a dream. He has a dream of a Black American bandstand. It will be called Soul Train. And before he sold it to syndication after a year and got rich, it shot from the Board of Trade building in Chicago. And he gave us peace, love, and soul. It's amazing. He made my Saturday mornings tolerable. Yeah. Jesse Jackson. This man is a chameleon. This man is a Renaissance man. But when it comes to the Chicago experience, I want to cite his most recent career in his relative youth. And that was as a politician. He ran for the presidency in the 1980s, and he was viable. I thought, Jesse, this country's not ready for a president named Jesse. And then I saw him in giving a speech to all of these farmers in Nebraska. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I don't see any white hoods yet. He's safe for a while. And they were into it. They were hanging on his every word. And then he was working the crowd. And I thought I was hallucinating. All these cowboy hats. And Jesse, I thought, wow, the world is changing. Oh, could have fooled me. Oh, the first African-American cardinal ordained by the Roman Catholic Church is, of course, a Chicago guy. Meet the incredibly cute Cardinal Wilton Gregory. Don't tell him I said he was cute, because that would be considered disrespectful to say that to any person of the cloth. If you've watched TV, and that's all of you, you too, Mike, you have probably been under the spell of Shonda Rhimes, the most powerful woman in Hollywood who's done so many programs I've never seen. but I hear they're really popular. Actually, I was addicted to Scandal for a year and I had to quit. I had to go cold turkey. I had to go to a clinic and everything. But she wields and she deals and she rocks and she rolls. And when it comes to Chicago and when it comes to TV, important thing here. Oprah Winfrey arrives in Chicago in 1893. In 1983, I'm saying she looks pretty good for having arrived in Chicago in 1893. She and Ida B. Wells came in on the same train. She gets to Chicago in 1983. 1 year later, one Michael Jeffrey Jordan arrives. Now, they arrive almost simultaneously in Chicago and they land in the same neighborhood. Oprah Winfrey's popularity, when she sells her wonderful program into syndication, she is rich. So one of the first things she does, she buys the old Armory building on the near west side at Washington and Elizabeth Street, just a little bit west of Halsted. Follow me with this one. Michael Jordan lands at the Chicago Stadium. Going west on Madison, about 1.5 miles, the original Madhouse on Madison. And back in the day when I was a kid, that was one of the roughest, worst neighborhoods in Chicago. And then these two particular people, Oprah and her brilliance and her Harpo studio, and Michael with his brilliance, the house that Michael built, the United Center. Not only does this change the perception within Chicago, but this neighborhood is one of the most expensive and nicest places to try to buy a condominium now. And the CTA opened up a whole new color L line to go through the neighborhood because of the popularity of Oprah and Michael Jordan and all of this new money that moved into the neighborhood. And they have forever and finally and definitively changed how our faces are used with regard to advertisement and product design. And when I see things like this, I think, yeah, we're dignified, but there's nobody more dignified in my mind. And I'm not even talking about politics. This man, his wife, and his children were in office for 8 years, and they got dragged around, people looking for scandal. And then they found it. The tan suit scandal. Oh! 8 years of this man said, I don't care what your politics are, there's never a more dignified president in my adult life anyway. And when I think of this man and his wife and his children, they're all the whole 6 feet tall family swaggering around now. I think of the Wall of Respect. The Wall of Respect was one of the first murals in Chicago. I think it in the late 1950s, if memory serves, it was one of the first ethnocentric, or I should say, ethnically driven murals in Chicago. And now they're all over the place, irrespective of the neighborhood, irrespective of many things. You go to a neighborhood in Chicago and you're going to see some beautiful murals with all kinds of people. You go to a Latino neighborhood, you go to Humboldt Park, you go to Pilsen, you see these beautiful murals. And it so reflects who we are, or at least what we can aspire to be. All of these things, and in our way, our murals and ourselves, our beautiful selves, we just make this beautiful, beautiful quilt. And every fiber of any quilt is absolutely vital, irrespective of the color, the hair texture, the skin color, the eye color, the ethnicity, the religion, anything. Every one of these fibers is absolutely vital to our survival and the continuation of our shared American narrative. Look for me on the History Channel. I'm on a couple of television shows you might see. Also look for me on the Cartoon Channel and Animal Planet. Joke, everybody. Also, if you like me or if you want to avoid me in the future, my Facebook page is facebook.com/Clarence or /music and Chicago stuff. My website, there it is, clarencegoodman.wixsite.com/Clarence Goodman. Got copies of my book with me, Nerd Avenue, Chicago in Stages and From the Stage. You get the joke. Very good, ma'am. Also, this summer, when you see one of these buses, tour narrative written by me. But most importantly, I want you to give a big round of applause to my new best friend, at least for another 5 minutes, Mike. over there doing the job. Come on, get it. Your hands are warm. And then also my buddy Janet there and everybody else with the library, and give yourselves a round of applause because you've dealt with me in this refrigerator for the last hour and 5 minutes. And all kidding aside, all jokes aside, until our paths cross again, if they do, enjoy your health, enjoy your prosperity, stay healthy, stay happy, but most importantly, keep on rocking your public library. Good night, and may your God go with you. That's where you all clap. Is that the camera? What have I got to do? Thanks. Janet, back to you, my friend. If people have questions, I'll make up plausible sounding answers. Yes, ma'am. Skiffle.
Oh, skiffle.
Skittle music would be pretty sweet. Skiffle, yes. Yeah, if you've ever read any histories of the Beatles especially, they all cite Lonnie Donegan, and every British kid who played a guitar or a wash tub or washboard or whatever, they cited this cat in Britain by the name of Lonnie Donegan. And Lonnie Donegan was playing the anglicized version of Chicago skiffle. So without Chicago, there'd be no Beatles. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
1919, the wars or the
Riots.
Riots.
Mhm.
Yes. Why do you think that they went throughout the United States, that it wasn't more localized? Was it like a chain reaction, like mayors from this city and that city all got together and decided maybe we should do this? Or I don't know, it just seems odd that it went across the nation.
I love how big-hearted you are. Americans don't like change. They don't like to be told what to do, and they don't like change to the status quo. And that's particularly when people own power and own property and so forth. So imagine the end of World War I and you are coming home. You are a white soldier and you've just fought in this great war, this war to end all wars. And Black people have moved all over your beloved city here and there. And my gosh, unions opened up to Black workers out of necessity during World War I. So you are some kind of PO'd. And you got to keep these colored people down. And the best way to keep people down is violence. That's why. Thank you for taking that answer. All right. I'm not going to throw you out. I'm just going to. All righty. I guess everybody's leaving. Don't care where you go, but you can't stay here, as I said. Give it up to Janet, and Janet will take it away from here. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Thank you. Now, don't stand up too fast because your knees are liable to be frozen at this point, my friends.